Thank you, Michael and Peter. I'll now speak to what's happening at K-12, and we want then at the end to have plenty of time for your thoughts and ideas. Before I dive in, can I just ask by show of hands, how many of you are right now teaching history in the middle or high school grades? Okay. How many are teaching history as one of the subject areas you cover in elementary education? Okay, great. One of the things that really struck me about Bill McClay's talk is the idea of and the importance of narrativity. If you haven't had a chance to read Land of Hope, I would encourage you to pick it up. It is unlike any other textbook that you've probably read. You know, there's a reason why most of us don't curl up in front of a fire with our favorite textbook, right? They're written by committees, they're dull, they're anodyne language, they're cobbled together, they run on for far too long. What we've lost so much of, I think, at the K-12 level is the idea that history is in fact a story, that we can make sense of it. And I think one of the things that I would come today to on the bad news side of things, because I'm not here to run through a parade of horribles, you probably are well familiar with them, in the area of civics and history learning, the bottom line is that today young people are not equipped and are not even proficient in the basic knowledge of our past, nor in what it takes to be a responsible upholder of the rights and responsibilities, really, of citizenship. The NAEP test in history and civics reveals that fewer than 1/4 of America's students reach that low bar even of proficiency. That's the only statistic I'll give you of the gross neglect that we've had in teaching these two important subjects. So there's lots of good news, though, I think, to report, and I want to make sure to reserve enough time to get to those things. But when you think about the challenge in front of us, I think of a comment that I heard recently that typifies what Peter just said about the way that academic historians so often treat this subject. This was a historian of early America who said that she approaches her teaching as a, quote, act of atonement. An act of atonement. Now, Bill McClay's insistence on story and his modeling of that for us prompted me to think about James Madison. Because he pointed, and Stanley Kurtz, you drew our attention to the Scottish influence on the American founders, particularly one James Madison. And I wanted to just relate a story at the outset here, because I think what you see in Jemmy Madison, the firstborn of 12, to a rich landholding, slave-owning family in Orange County, Virginia, is the way that history can be learned, understood, and used in the service of the good of all. Now, because of the privileged status of Madison's family, they were able to afford a tutor. He was tutored, sent off then to what now is Princeton University, then the College of New Jersey, when he was 16 years old. He was able to go through his studies in not the usual 4, but in 2. He then stayed on an extra semester to study with the president of the university, the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon. A signer of the Declaration of Independence, Witherspoon was thoroughly steeped in the Scottish Enlightenment. In fact, he was one of the main ways that was conveyed to the shores of this country. Madison stayed on because he wanted to study his 5th language, Hebrew, and also reflect on some of the big thorny issues, including what we might see as kind of the problem of evil. Fascinating kind of thing, right? He was devoted to the study of big problems. Now, upon concluding his studies, he was then, he found himself back home. Not unlike many millennials today, he was charged with doing things to help the household, and one of those things was to tutor his siblings. He was not happy about this situation. He would write off to his buddies from college, "You got to tell me about your life because mine right now is not very interesting." But you know what happened to him? he looked around, and as a young man, thoroughly studied in history, in classics, in what you all are doing, the liberal arts. Madison had kindled in his heart a stirring towards action, because what he had seen around him, that there were certain people, namely Baptists, who did not happen to share his particular Protestant affiliation. He was a member of the kind of a majority Congregationalists, those who were part of the established Anglican Church, really. And yet he saw in Baptists who were put down, kept down, sometimes even imprisoned, a few of them tortured, for merely expressing their faith, for acting on those things that their conscience told them. And Madison's study of history said to him, I wonder if there's a way to do this differently. I wonder if we could come up with an arrangement by which people's conscience could be respected. And what began in that stirring in that young 20-something was something that over the course of the next 40 years resulted in one of the most remarkable legislative and statesmanlike productions of protection to those not only religious minorities, but minorities of any kind who find themselves on the losing end of a majority vote. Madison's project became America's project because of his indefatigable support of ideas that are rooted in the Western tradition. Let me relate one of those and how it came to be, because I think this is really fascinating to think about the conjunction of history and civics. If I make one point today, it would be that when we study history, we should put it at the heart of citizenship education. History and civics go together. And for Madison, as he became a mature statesman and legislator par excellence, he went back to his study of history over and over again. When he would send a memo around, usually his chief audience was an audience of one, and that was George Washington. One of his memos was called Notes on Ancient and Modern Confederacies. This was issued to George Washington during the heart of the kind of crisis in our early existence, before we yet had the United States Constitution and while we were operating under the Articles of Confederation. George Washington had said this about the Articles, quote, "We had probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our Confederation. We must take human nature as we find it. Perfection falls not to the share of mortals," end quote. We are people. People are not able to be perfected. What can we learn from history? We learn some of those deficiencies. In this case, Madison went back and looked at the history of republics and said that we cannot continue to think that we can do it as they did and still become a large, influential, commercial republic. Thus was born some of his ideas that became Federalist 10 and that became, I would argue, really the warp and woof of our American understanding. Madison earned the title Father of the Constitution in large measure because of that theorizing that he did, but it was historically rooted theorizing, informed first and foremost by a deep reflection on what it means to be a human being. Now, that's something that we can perhaps take away from the American founding. What is presented today? Too often, we see in our textbooks not only that anodyne presentation of American history, bland, not particularly evocative of story. Just as much, I'd say, and probably even more, we see kind of a Howard Zinn light. Earlier, Michael shared with us a quotation from the historian Michael Kazin, who teaches at Georgetown University. He, as a social historian, is disturbed by the low quality of Howard Zinn's scholarship and says you can do a lot better. But I would argue that the 1619 project that Dr. Wood points us to is in fact the kind of brainchild of people like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. Because what it shares with them is a historiography of suspicion, of Manichaean proportions. It's a story of heroes and villains. And for Howard Zinn, the chief villains are the founders of the United States. He characterizes the American founding as one of, quote, guns and greed. What has happened, I think, is so often in our social studies departments across this country, with some 250,000 or so educators that teach under that rubric, is that history has gotten swallowed up. We have lost sight of the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the principles therein. We've made that kind of a dead letter, and at the same time, we've made the Constitution living. And what happens then is that it's easy for a project like 1619, which I would argue should not be in our K-12 schools because it is not good history. It's easy to do a kind of Manichaean fable for young people, right? It's kind of fun to stick it to the man, right, and say that we ought to do a kind of a weaponization of history. Kids gravitate towards that. That's why Zinn has sold 2.5 million copies. It's a story. A lot of teachers teach it in combination with their textbook because they say at least the kids want to read this. Well, what has turned into a kind of point counterpart has now come to be much the dominant way that many young people come to understand our history, which is a kind of Howard Zinn light. It paves the way for things like the 1619 Project. When we say about the errors that are rampant in it, so what? Print the legend, right? Go with the thing that sounds good, that comports with the current zeitgeist. And I would argue today that the work that you all are doing in staying true to true viewpoint diversity in your history classes, in your civics lessons, is really vital. And I would urge you to stay the course, because what we really need to see is not civics defined as a kind of regime loyalty. You know, a few years ago, I had occasion to give a talk just after Saddam Hussein had been ousted in Baghdad. This talk was for educators in Iraq who were charged with the task of rebuilding civil society. I, not a speaker of Arabic, I had to rely on a translator, and when I used the word civics, I noticed that it had not landed very well with the audience. The translation that was given was regime loyalty. Loyalty to the ruler, to the top guy. Well, that's what they lived through, right? Today we have the opportunity, I think, because of the polarization in our country, to refashion history and civics education. It's an opportunity born of crisis. As you can see from the work that has been done by ACTA and by the National Association of Scholars, this is not a crisis that is tied only, however, to polarization. This is a crisis long in the making. It's a crisis, however, that is completely able to be averted, yet we have not done so. I'd argue that in keeping with the themes of this conference, we should look to classical education as an antidote to the politicized, weaponized way that we have done history and too often civics. My organization, the Bill of Rights Institute, is devoted to supporting school teachers all across the country. We do so mainly working with district public school teachers, but we're also working in with charter public school teachers and with educators in private and homeschool settings. We publish curricula. We've just concluded a project that will be released next month, 3 years in the making, to write a comprehensive history of the United States. We hired 100 academic historians. Among them are people whose names you would likely recognize, 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, and folks that disagree profoundly in their interpretation of history. Yet what we've done with this resource, which will be published with Rice University's OpenStax, is take that disagreement and surface it for the students, so that on questions like, is the United States Constitution a pro-slavery document, there can be a multiplicity of viewpoints, each of which is represented by a scholar that has a byline, at the end of which then, and at the end of deep reflection, we hope by those students, they can enter into that conversation. To do it any other way, I believe, short-circuits the learning process. Because if you do like the 1619 Project does with the Declaration of Independence, and you ask your students to create an erasure poem. I had not been as familiar with the idea of erasure poetry until I encountered the Pulitzer Center's lesson plan. Many of you, I'm sure, work with lesson plans. But imagine this one when you teach the Declaration of Independence. Take the words, hardly known at all to students, but blot out those things that you wish not to see to reveal your inner feelings about the document. So in other words, you take the document and you quite literally erase the bulk of it to reveal words then that strung together give you a kind of sentiment, a feeling about what this thing really conveys. Now that is a short-circuiting of the way in which sound learning should happen. Because first you would think you would want to come to a knowledge of what the document says on its own terms. Classical learning in the liberal arts tradition, the thing about which we're gathered here to reflect on, asks us to do that. It invites young people to do that. And my experience has been in a variety of educational settings that they love to do so. There is something exhilarating about that, taking a step in the direction of another mind and confronting those ideas. After which then you can wonder with them, and they on their own you hope for a lifetime, is this true? Is it right? But if you lead them down a path in which you short-circuit those questions and automatically bring them to quick and hasty judgment, there's no ability for that kind of reflection. That, I think, is what we have done far too much of, and that, unfortunately, is one of the sorry legacies of the academic trends that we've pointed to today coming to the place of K-12. I think, however, in closing, there's a lot of ways in which we can tap those deep roots of classical education to rediscover what history really can be. Not only are there fascinating connections between the study of rhetoric and civics, but there's a way in which I think operating in a mode of classical learning brings out history as inquiry, as wonder, as curiosity, that you treat it on its own terms, and that you not use history merely as an instrumentality. That's what we've seen happen. And whether it happens from the right or from the left, in academia or in K-12, it's wrong. So I think the opportunity here is to, by rediscovering history in this way that I've described, put it back at the heart of civics. Because if we try to do civic education absent that, it will fail. Why don't I stop there, and we're happy to now take your questions. I'll ask that you keep your questions to actual question length. And if you don't mind, for everybody's benefit, just identifying yourselves and where you teach, that would help us for those of us who do not know you. And we'll jump in and spend the rest of our time in conversation. Thank you very much.